Morena, Michael, welcome to the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee. Good to see you down at Heriot-Edievale this morning, early morning, and thanks very much for presenting so early. We've allocated you 15 minutes this morning. You can take your written submission as read and leave a few minutes at the end for questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning all committee members. I'd like to, I know my submission's been taken as read, but I'd like to go through a few things and a few highlights of it.
Sure.
I'd start off by saying New Zealand's at a junction when it comes to inter-regional passenger rail and public transport more generally. Will it continue almost entirely focusing on urban passenger rail investment in just Auckland or Wellington, or can it expand across the national network, extending back to New Zealand's heartland as part of our national PT network? And at the heart of this is, what sort of country do we want us to be? I mean, at stake are things like social equity, national connectivity, transport accessibility, meeting our climate change commitments, improved transport safety, regional rejuvenation, affordable housing, economic development, and patriotic national pride even, as one joined-up nation. We probably need some sort of national economic development plan, but focusing on a particular region to start off with, as my Making Rail work colleagues just before me have talked about, in particular looking at growth corridors and housing, employment, industrial development, population and immigration strategy. Transport planning facilitates this, and the Golden Triangle is an ideal case study in that regard. Few things give perception of United Nation like a quality rail network. It helps build national pride, but of course it's not an end in itself, and it's only really as useful as part of a national development vision as well as regional development visions. So we therefore need a consensus nationally to identify opportunities and problems that we're trying to solve. There's no point in looking at passenger rail saying just want more trains. We need to look at it as to the problem that we're trying to solve, and to help to use it to make New Zealand realise its potential, its full potential. And we need to put an end, I would say, is some of the institutional bias from the past that has impacted rail and public transport more generally in New Zealand. The Treasury, the Ministry of Transport, Infrastructure New Zealand policy positions, in my view, reflect poor legislative frameworks. The organisations themselves are not necessarily against rail, of course. I wouldn't say they were, but the legislative framework needs some changes, I think. And Waka Katohai and Kiwi Rail can only do what they're empowered and legislation allows them to do. So I see there's some significant deficiency in the current process. Everything has to be instigated by regions, but inter-regional or national public transport can be a national issue as well as a regional issue. It makes inter-regional rail and public transport challenging across the nation. Where is our national vision? Who's responsible for that? And central government agency leadership to some degree is required. Again, not taking away from the fact that regional ownership is really important. But for regional partnerships, inter-regional public transporters and rail to develop, that's very important. The current process and legislative framework is heavily biased towards intra-regional and has worked well for Auckland and Wellington, but not so much elsewhere. It's not really adequate for a public transport nationwide lens. I would say an establishment of a stronger national public transport function, again, not taking away from our case study of Making Rail work on the Golden Triangle, is important to help plan and mandate develop national and regional integrated public transport, not just for trains, but for buses and ferries as well. It would help alignment with national development priorities and ensure business cases are funded not just as regional activities, but as national development ones. So policy legislative framework changes are required. Again, we suggest we start with the Golden Triangle as our first domino. It's not a replacement for regional council transport functions, far from it. The key thing I hear is that the people need to be close to the railway and feel ownership about it, hence the reasons we talk about cooperatives. And so it's just joined up PT planning at a national level will help with that. It won't take away from it, it will actually help with it. Currently, these functions don't sit at the top table in the Ministry of Transport either, or Waka Katohai or Kiwi Rail, and it's not given the gravitas it deserves. I won't go into the reasons as to why interpassage rail, because that's well covered in my submission. But I'd like to say also that buses are important. I think sometimes there's a focus on rail in isolation, say, oh, we just should have trains everywhere in New Zealand. I think it's really important to understand there's a lot of places in New Zealand where rail, even though there's a rail line, it's simply not viable for passenger rail, and buses should be considered. So it's about focusing where rail works. And a good example of where it works currently is between Wellington and the Wairarapa, because you've got the Rimutaka Tunnel. But going forward, so before getting into my conclusions, it's the key recommendations that I'd like to think about here. First of all, I'd like to say this is not a KiwiRail structure issue. Often people blame KiwiRail. They're just a delivery vehicle under contract, and it's important people understand that. But legislative and policy settings and Ministry of Transport and Waka Katohai empowerment are really important. So I'm suggesting changes to the Land Transport Management Act 2003, required in concert with changes to an inadequate general policy statement on transport when it comes to regional transport or interregional transport. Both need to reflect national interregional public transport aspirations, but at the moment they're all currently regionally focused. Changes to a national rail plan and the resulting in 30-year network investment plan are important. Now, a change to the GPS will enable that, and asking ourselves, what does good look like? The transport and PT industry delivery structure reform, including details on the operating model at Waka Katohai MOT and accountability and the value for money are all critical. We need to get public transport costs under control. National and regional public transport planning needs to be better integrated nationally. So we need a strong national public transport planning function. It could be part of NZTA, there's no reason why not, but it needs to sit at the top table. It shouldn't be buried somewhere down in the organisation. Regional agency and grassroots community advocacy is absolutely critical. The people need to be involved regionally, and involvement is critical to help planning be attuned to local needs. But so Auckland Transport and those organisations of the regional transport are critical, but we need that national lens, which is currently lacking. And funding sources, there's so many of them, I won't go into all of them, but you can include a mix of fare box revenue on affordable fares, which is important, transit-orientated developments, for example, the central Hamilton station under the Centre Place Mall. Tainui, for example, are looking to redevelop that, and they could be a key stakeholder in helping develop passenger rail around Hamilton. Land value capture, fuel taxes and general taxation from the National Transport Fund, but local body rates, overseas funding partners. I've been talking to people like KfW IPEX Bank from Germany, who I have a relationship with, and they're very keen to come to New Zealand. Export financing, wet leasing, community-based partnerships, the development corporations and the cooperatives that Katrina and Susan talked about, and making rail work as a test case, population growth and accessibility from the population. And the delivery agents, the way it's actually physically delivered on the ground as a rail operation, there's many ways to do that. You can have franchises, you can have the cooperative running a part of the railway, you can have the national state operator like KiwiRail does, and continuous improvements over 10 to 30 years is important. We don't have to do all at once. As I said before, Golden Triangle first, Lower North Island, probably hot on the heels of that with improved services to Horowhenua and Manawatu. And it's not needed on all lines as we talked about. Rolling stock selection should be to national standards and not ad hoc. And also recommend a rolling program over time of electrification between Pukekohe, Hamilton and Tauranga as a priority. Affordable fares are important from the modal shift. And one of the last things I'd say is that the rail and infrastructure construction industry capability needs to improve, together with rail delivery knowledge, enabled by pipeline of projects to give the deliverers of infrastructure in New Zealand a more certain pipeline, so that'll enable them to commit to New Zealand and have a rolling program, and the national infrastructure body can help with that. Also, I'd suggest an Academy of Rail to build competency and knowledge in New Zealand. And the last thing I'd like to say, this is non-partisan. I believe we should have non-partisan political support. Yes, each government of the day will have its own political flavour, just like they do everywhere else in the world, and that's fine. But there's certain fundamentals that we should keep in place, and consensus building is really important. I'd like to say ambition and new thinking is required, and let us together make rail work.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Question from Honourable David Bennett.
Thank you, Michael, and another great submission and some really good points in there. I just want to see if you can just expand on that sort of value capture, private sector involvement part of it, because they're great terms and people on the committee will know, but the public that are listening probably don't have as great a grasp of what that could actually look like in practice. So, you know, if I just give you the example, if you built a a new town at Tipoi, and you gave the developer, you know, that had 1,000 hectares there, just say it was Tainui, and you said to them, well, you know, if you develop this town, you've got to put the railway in to make it work, you know, and then they can be part of that cooperative model. Is that what you envisage, and is that, you know, like that's the Australian model, what they're doing in their regional towns to build infrastructure? What do you see it working here, and is that a feasible option?
Oh, no, absolutely, David, and thank you for the question. Excellent question. The development levies and getting people on board to begin with is really important. When you go back to the 19th century, the railways in America, the railroad barons, etc., the way railways were funded in those days was by opening up the land and development and having some capture of that, to say, well, I'm going to take the railway through your town. We're going to add a lot of value to your town, so therefore you should pay a rate or a contribution or something to help us build our railway. I mean, of course, we don't want to be held hostage like the railroad barons did in the 19th century, but ways of funding that are critical. I worked at the Department of Transport in Victoria as heading up public transport planning for a few years, back around 2017, 18, 19. And that's exactly what we were proposing there. We were looking at extending some of our tram lines in the outer parts of Melbourne, and we were looking at value capture along the corridor. And the best example there is also the suburban rail loop, which is being developed in Melbourne. And a lot of that capture is around giving concessions. And you just need to look at home in New Zealand, at the Britomart precinct in Auckland, how the value capture to some extent has been not as good as it could have been, but it hasn't been too bad. Huge development happened above Britomart, and Britomart was a catalyst for the development of the whole downtown area of Auckland. And from a cooperative point of view, absolutely, getting these people involved in the cooperative would be perfect, and it's a good way forward for raising capital and securing it.
Well, Michael, I think that's great, and it's great you've got that experience. I'd suggest that you write to the committee with an additional submission with an example of how it could work, how we could build a 30,000 person town off the back of an extension of the rail network, or use of the rail network. How we could get the private sector to fund a chunk of that, so it's not government money, and how we could actually make that work. Okay, so you know, to give us a practical example, that's what we've been testing with the other government officials and other submitters, and but we need some examples, and you've got the experience to do that. So if you're willing to do that, I think it'd be valuable for the committee.
Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. And also, as an adjunct to that, Katrina alluded, and Susan did too, about the paper we're working on for next year as well. So that'll build on that.
Hey, thanks very much, Michael. That does bring us to the end of your 15 minutes. So appreciate your contribution today, both written and orally, and look forward to seeing you in this conversation moving forward.
Thank you very much.